All right, James, let's test your audio. Can you just do a quick kind of mic check, make sure we can hear you?
Yeah, how's this sound? Am I coming through clear?
Sounds great on my end. If anyone can't hear, just shoot me a quick message. But everyone should be able to hear myself and James clear, who's about to drop the mic on this lovely Sunday. So it is top of the hour right now, and I'll just quickly kind of welcome everybody to this call. This is something that the Trilogy team has been talking about for a while. For those of you who are just joining, we're going to have a session led by James Clear today on habits, productivity, and how it really applies to students and teachers and just really life in general. So you're in for a real treat. Over the last several weeks, we've been emailing you little tidbits from some of James's writings. And so you probably all know by now that you're in for some interesting and really applicable information. Can you still hear me, James? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically, James, just to give you guys a real quick intro on James, he writes about behavioral psychology, habit formation, and performance improvement. He's been featured all over the internet. He's probably got close to 500,000 email subscribers now. And some kind of recent news is James is going to be launching a book on habits with Penguin Random House sometime next year. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be an incredible book. And then stay to the end of the call today. And I'm going to share a link with everybody because he has a free download on habits. It's a 45-page PDF that everybody's going to have access to. So the primary reason I just love what you're about, James, is that simple question that you want to answer, which is how can we live better? And so I love that mission you have, and I'm excited that you're here with us today. Everyone that's joining, welcome, welcome. My name is JB. I'm a career director with Trilogy Education, and we've got James Clear in the house. So James, without further ado, I'd love to pass the mic over to you, my friend, and we're all in attendance and rocking and rolling.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind intro. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here as well and share some of this information today. I just want to, the one thing I'm going to do right now is share my screen with you all so you can see the presentation with me. And just let me know in the chat if everybody can see this. I just want to make sure before we get going. Okay, it should be up there now. Jeremy, are you seeing it?
Yes, I can see it.
All right, cool. I see a lot of people saying it looks good. All right, thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. So this is a presentation about the surprising power of small habits, how habits work, and kind of mastering the art of continuous improvement. And that means not only applied to programming and coding, but also to life in general. And so I hope that you'll find this presentation practically useful, as well as interesting and kind of maybe scientifically insightful. So first thing, an overview. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm James Clear. I've been writing about habits and human performance for the last 4 or 5 years now. You can find my work on jamesclear.com. We'll drop a couple links into the presentation at the end. This session is going to be about 1 hour of content, get plus or minus 10 minutes, just kind of depends on how things go. And then I'm happy to stay for up to 30 minutes of Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions that arise as we're talking, as I'm going through the material, as I have you do a couple exercises, feel free to write those down so that you can go back and draw on those when it comes time for Q&A. And then during the session, we're going to have a few live exercises, really probably just one. I kind of tightened it up a little bit right before we jumped on. And we'll talk about a variety of content about how to build better habits. So I hope that you'll find this useful. And to get started, I'm going to tell you a quick story. So about 10 or 15 years ago, British cycling was in this interesting spot where they were really middle of the road. They're very mediocre on the world stage. So this was early 2000s. They hired this guy named Dave Brailsford, and they had never won a Tour de France. And British cyclists had won a single gold medal back in 1908. So their performance was very average relative to many other countries. And they said, we want to change this. What's your plan for doing so? And so Brailsford believed in this concept that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. And the way that he described it was the 1% improvement in nearly everything that you do. So they looked at all the different areas related to cycling, and they tried to figure out how they could improve them by just 1%. And they started with a bunch of things that you would expect a cycling team to focus on. For example, they made the bike tire slightly lighter. They figured out how to get a more ergonomic seat on the bike. They had their outdoor riders wear indoor racing suits because they were lighter and more aerodynamic. They had each rider wear a little biofeedback sensor so they could see how each individual was responding to training and then adjust their practice appropriately. But then they also did a bunch of things that you wouldn't expect a cycling team to do. For example, they taught their riders how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infection and getting sick, catching a cold. They split tested different types of massage gels to see which one would lead to the best form of muscle recovery. They even figured out the type of pillow that led to the best night's sleep for each rider, and then they brought that on the road with them to hotels when they were competing. And Brailsford said, if we can actually execute on this, if we can, make all these little changes related to cycling, then I think we can win a Tour de France within 5 years. He ended up being wrong. They won the Tour de France in 3 years, and then they repeated again the 4th year. And then after 1 year of not winning, they've won 2 more in a row. And so now they've reached the point where they've won 4 of the last 5 Tour de France's. But it was at the Olympics in London in 2012 where this kind of really came to fruition, when the British cyclists won 70% of the gold medals available. And so this idea that small improvements, that little habits are not just nice to have, they're not just a little improvement, they actually can be very significant over the long run. That's an idea that I'd like for us to carry with us as we go throughout this presentation. This idea that small habits don't just, make a little difference on a daily basis, they actually make up the margin between success and failure. They create the gap between mediocrity and high performance. And we can see this just in a very simple math sort of way. So if you get 1% better each day for a year, then you end up 37 times better at the end of the year. If you get 1% worse each day for a year, then you whittle yourself almost all the way down to 0. Now, of course, real life doesn't work this way, right? Exactly in a mathematical format. And it's actually very hard to get 1% better every single day of the year. But the point being that habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. They accumulate over the long run, right? They add up in good ways and in bad ways. And without us even realizing it, they end up creating the difference between who we are and who we could be. And so time and time again, what you end up seeing is that the highest achievers are the ones who have the best habits, simply because they accumulate in such an important way over the long run. Now, what's interesting is everybody wants a transformation, right? Whenever we think about changing, we all want to transform. We want this radical epiphany, this incredible change overnight. But we fail to realize that our habits are actually transforming us every day anyway. That these small choices that we make to eat something slightly better or slightly worse, to spend our time in a slightly more productive way or slightly less productive way, to align our values and actions in a way that's just a little bit better rather than a little bit worse, that those are the things that transform us over life. And so small habits have this remarkable power to impact where we go and who we become. Now, the natural question is, okay, that's great, but how do you actually build better habits? Why do some habits stick while others fail? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to discuss habits from an inside-out perspective. So we're going to start with the things that are most under your control, the most central to you, and even in some cases, surprisingly deep. Like, for example, how habits shape our deepest sense of self and our identity, our sense of who we are. And then how habits are wired into the brain, actions that are under our control, so what we set as priorities and what we don't. And then we'll gradually work our way out to influences that are less under our control, like the environment or the people around us, and how those things influence our habits and behaviors as well. So before we use this inside-out framework, I'd like to start with just a quick exercise, and we're just going to take 3 to 5 minutes to do this. But what I'd like you to do is think about the most important goal that you have for yourself for the next 6 months. And if you're having trouble deciding which one's the most important, just go ahead and pick one of your top goals. And I want you to imagine that 6 months from now and that you have failed, that this important goal has not been achieved. Write the story of how that happened. This is called a failure pre-mortem. So before you fail, we're going to write the story of what caused it to fail. So we're going to spend the next 3 to 5 minutes. We'll go till maybe 12 after, maybe 12 to 15 after. I just want you to write a few paragraphs about that goal and what caused it to go wrong. So go ahead and do that now, and I'll mute myself for the next few minutes, and then we'll hop back in. All right, that's been 3 or 4 minutes now. So I just wanted to give you a short dip into that exercise. Before the year started, when we kind of did my annual review with my team, we did this, and it was one of the most effective things that we did. So if you find this exercise interesting, to do this little failure pre-mortem, talk about the story of how your goals might fail, I would encourage you to do a more extended version of that once we get done, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and just kind of like free write about that. And what's interesting is that a lot of the time we know the things that take us off track. And we're going to talk about later in this presentation what we can do to make sure that those things don't happen. And I'd like to encourage you, one reason I did this early in the presentation is so that you can have those roadblocks and those challenges top of mind as we talk about how habits work and effective things we can do for building better habits. So keep those in mind as we go throughout the rest of the presentation, and you may find that some of the information that we cover directly addresses the pain point that you just journaled about or thought about for a few minutes. So, all right, let's continue this inside-out framework about habits, right? We're going to start with the things that are most central, deepest to us, and then we're going to work our way out. Okay, so first, part one, mindset. I like to think about behavior change like the layers of an onion. So, for example, the outermost layer are your results. So this is like goal-oriented change. We want to change the outcome. We want to change the results, the success. Okay, so the first layer, the outermost layer, are your results. The second layer in are your actions. So this is the habits and behaviors that you perform, the routines that you do, your plan of action for achieving a particular result. And usually, when we ask people, what's your plan for success? Like, how are you going to try to approach improving? It always stops at those two layers. People think about the goal that they want to achieve, and then they come up with an action plan for achieving that. I would like to argue that there's one layer deeper, a core of behavior change that I'm going to call your identity. And I think that when it comes to building better habits, one of the most effective things we can do is to focus on the type of identity we want to build, the type of person that we want to become, rather than the type of results that we want to achieve. And so one of the most common mistakes that people make when it comes to building new habits is thinking about what they want to achieve rather than who they want to become. And we can define this as like having versus being. So the first column is, what do I need to do in order to have this result? What do I need to do in order to earn a promotion, to lose 40 pounds, to run a marathon? But the second column is more about who is the type of person that could achieve this result. So who do I need to be in order for that to happen? Who is the type of person that could lose 40 pounds, or the type of person that could learn a new language, or the type of person that can meditate each morning? And as an example, who's the type of person that could lose 40 pounds? Well, maybe it's the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, for example, just to give you one idea. And when you think about who you want to become rather than what you want to have, it becomes easier to figure out what the process is behind these results. There's nothing wrong with wanting to achieve great results. It's awesome. There's nothing incorrect about trying to strive for success. But so often we talk about life only in terms of success. We talk about current events, right? The Broadway show became a hit. The album became a bestseller. The book hit the New York Times list. They're all events. And this constant talk about events and outcomes causes us to forget or overlook the underlying process behind those things. We talk about the Olympian winning the gold medal, but we don't talk about the 4 years of work that came before it. And so this shift from having to being helps us focus on the habits that underlie the identities that drive those results. So with the standard approach, we do something in order to have something. With identity-based habits, we do something in order to become someone. And the wonderful thing is that if you are focused on becoming the type of person that you want to be, then even when the result occurs, when any given success happens, you still get to hang on to that. The problem, one of the downsides with focusing only on goals and outcomes and results is that once the goal is achieved, suddenly that is all gone. It's no longer motivating because you have now reached that. But if you're focused on the identity, you can always be focused on being that type of person, regardless of whether the result comes or not. So what's interesting here is that identity comes from the late Latin word essentias, which means being, and identidem, which means repeatedly. So your identity is literally your repeated beingness. So it's the type of person that you show up as each day. Your habits are central, in other words, to your identity. And so the way to change your identity, the way to become the type of person that you want to become, is through doing things. So being through doing. Every time you sit down to write, you are being a writer. Every time you play a sport, you are being an athlete. Every time you paint a painting or draw a drawing or compose music, you're being an artist. And so the idea here is that if you think, well, I'm not the type of person that I want to be, or I have not yet become the type of person that could achieve the results I want, the point is the way to do that is through building better habits. So let's think about a couple questions here. I want to just center this a little bit on programming and coding, because I know that's what Trilogy talks about so often. Who do you need to become to have the kind of life you want, or the kind of career that you want? Who is the type of person who can become a great programmer? These are just some questions that I'm seeding to you to consider and think about how these concepts of identity-based habits apply specifically to what you're working on now. All right, so the key point here is the way to reshape your identity is to build stronger habits, and identity is at the core of any sustained long-term behavior change. I think one of the most important points about this is that once you are no longer trying to change your identity, you're just acting in alignment with who you already are. We're no longer talking about behavior change. You're just being the type of person you are. And that is why it's the most powerful form of building better habits. So, all right, that's part one. Set the stage with mindset. Let's focus on the type of person that we want to become. How do we actually do that? This is starting to get into the practical application now. Priorities. First, we have to clear the space to allow improvement to happen. We have to clear the space to allow better habits to be built. I'd like to tell a quick story about this. So there's this concept called the Zeigarnik effect, psychological concept. And my favorite story about it, there's these group of 4 guys who went to lunch together in Germany. I think this was like 1920s, 1930s. So they go to lunch and they sit down. The waiter comes over, asks them what they'd like to have to eat. And everybody goes around the table and orders, and the waiter doesn't write any of it down, right? He's just trying to remember it all in his mind. And it's a fairly complex order for 4 people. And so the waiter walks away and they're like, there's no way he's going to remember all that. Very complicated, whatever. But the food comes out and the waiter got it right. So they're impressed. They have a great meal. They get done eating. And they walk out of the restaurant. And as they're walking down the street, one guy realizes, oh, I forgot my wallet. And so he turns around and goes back to the restaurant, flags down the waiter. And the waiter walks over and he says, can I help you? And the guy was like, oh, well, I forgot my wallet at our table. And the waiter said, sorry, who are you? Like, where were you sitting? And the guy was like, really? Like, we were just talking about how great your memory was. You just served us. We had this complicated meal and you remembered all of it. And the waiter said, oh, I only remember each order until it's completed. And what's interesting is that there's this concept known as the Zeigarnik effect that says that the brain has a tendency to remember intrusive thoughts about an objective that was once pursued but left incomplete. So for example, you have an order that's placed but it has not yet been fulfilled. It's very likely that that takes up space in your brain, that you're more likely to hold on to that. So there's this curiosity gap, this like nagging brain between something that we have started but not completed. And this has a really interesting impact for our daily behavior, because how many of us have projects that are open right now? How much half work do you have, right? How many projects do you have open that have not been completed? And you can kind of view your brain a little bit like the RAM in a computer. The more projects you have open, the more that's being used up. So you don't have 100% capacity to give to the given task that you're working on. Instead, you have 90% or 80 or 70 or 60. And the more open loops that we have in our lives, the more our brain is fatigued, or at least those resources are being allocated to all these tasks that have been left incomplete, which prevents us from delivering our full self to the task at hand. So in order to overcome this, we need some method to clear space for improvement, to trim away those loose ends so that we can focus more fully on the thing that's most important. I'd like to give you one strategy for doing that right now. This is called the Eisenhower box. It was first used, at least first place I'd come across it, was from President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1940s and 50s. And Eisenhower used this 4-quadrant system. And so I'm going to talk through it right now, but if you want to download a copy of this, you can get it at jamesclear.com/ebox. It's just a free download for you to grab if you want it. But you can easily draw this on a piece of paper or whatever. So the idea here is that across the top, we have urgent tasks and we have not urgent tasks. And then across the side, we have important tasks and we have unimportant tasks. And if it's urgent and important, well, that's quite easy to convince yourself to do, right? I mean, it's a hair on fire emergency, and it's something that you need to really get done. So nothing to do there. If it's not urgent, but it is important, quadrant 2, this group is the group that we often overlook, right? It's things that we know we should be doing, like exercising, for example. or sticking with some kind of habit like meditation, but it's never urgent to do it, right? On any given day, it's easy to overlook that, but it's really something that we need to stick with. So for those tasks, for the quadrant 2 tasks, we need to decide when those are going to be done, schedule them into our life. And I'll talk more about some effective ways to schedule better good habits in a little bit. Quadrant 3, this is the quadrant that often sucks away our time and energy. They're urgent tasks, but they're not really that important. There are all those emergencies that come into your inbox every morning and you feel like you're responding to everybody else's agenda except your own. And so these tasks need to be delegated. And I don't just mean delegate to someone else to do. If that's possible, that's great. But you can also automate those tasks, or you can delegate it to a different time when it's more effective to work on that. So, just because it's someone else's emergency doesn't mean it has to be your priority in that given moment. And then, so the last one is delete. These are tasks that aren't urgent and they're not important, but for some reason they just kind of have still slipped into our lives. And a lot of the time what I find is those are a case of inertia. They may have been important during a previous time, but they're no longer important now. So the Eisenhower box, that's one strategy we can use for pruning away those things that are not the most important and focusing on those that are. And the core idea here is that human life is more like a rose bush than a tree. We often think that we're like a tree, that we can grow wider and taller and bigger and take on more and more responsibilities as time goes on. But in fact, we're much more like a rose bush. And a rose bush is more of a contained size. And in order for a rose bush to fully blossom, you have to prune away the buds. And in many cases, you have to prune away buds that are good. Like they would actually turn into a flower, but you need to prune them away so the few can just flourish. And this is the same case for our daily lives. We have tasks that in a lot of cases are actually a good use of our time, but they're not a great use of our time. And those are the ones that are hardest to clip away, but they're also the ones that are most essential. It's easy for someone to rationalize getting rid of something that's wasteful, right? Or not wasting an hour on something that doesn't drive significant outcomes. But what about something that's like number 6 on your priority list rather than number 1 or 2? Those are much harder to cut away because they're easy to rationalize. But what I'm saying here is that they're just as essential to prune away and focus only on the 1 or 2 things that matter most. And this is a hard thing to do. And I could talk a lot about this because it starts to get into areas like work-life balance and how you decide to focus your energy and attention in your life. And that, of course, is a big topic. But I hope that the Eisenhower box is enough to kind of get us started there. And if we want to talk more about it in Q&A, we can. All right, so once we know what to work on, how do we actually make it a habit? How do habits work? So I'd like to lay out what I call the 4 stages of habit formation. I spent some time, I probably spent, a few months actually, digging in and researching all of the major models on human improvement over the last 150 years, from areas like psychology to evolutionary biology and behavior. And I tried to see what was similar about them. What did certain models get right? What did certain models get wrong? And which ones apply to human behavior and habit formation? And what can we learn about that? And so what I ended up coming up with after all that research is that there are 4 primary stages that every habit goes through, and really most human behaviors go through this cycle. And as this cycle gets repeated more and more, it ends up being turned into a habit. So let's talk about each one. First, so we're going clockwise here from the top left. So the first stage of habit formation is a trigger. The second is desire. The third is an action. And the fourth is a reward. And so as we continue around this loop, 1, 2, 3, 4, the more that we move around here, the deeper the habit gets encoded in our brain and the more that we learn to do that particular behavior. All right, let's talk about each one. So stage 1, triggers. The trigger is the thing that causes us to notice something. It is the thing that cues the behavior, that prompts the behavior. It sparks some kind of action. So for example, if I walk into a kitchen and I see a plate of cookies on the counter, the plate of cookies is the trigger. And then the desire is that I want to eat the cookie, right? I start to crave it or I desire it. The action is I pick it up and eat it. So that's the habit itself. And then the reward is that either, biologically, I enjoy how the cookie tastes, or psychologically, I wanted it and now I get to satisfy that craving. But that is the cycle: trigger, desire, action, reward. So we notice something in the first stage, we want something in the second stage, we do something in the third stage, and then we enjoy something like something in the fourth stage. So notice, want, do, like. Those are the 4 stages of most human behaviors. And what is interesting is that the more that we repeat this cycle, the deeper it gets into our subconscious, the more non-conscious and automatic it becomes. I don't mean subconscious in the way that, like, it's some mysterious thing that you have no control over. I simply mean that behaviors can be learned and conditioned the same way that, for example, you learn to tie your shoes and you don't even really think about it now, right? In the beginning, you had to think very deeply about how to do that. And now you can have a conversation while you're tying your shoes. It's more or less mindless. It has been conditioned. So stage 1 of this process is the trigger. It's the thing that causes you to notice something, to want to do the behavior. Now, there are 2 different types of triggers. There are cold triggers and there are hot triggers. And BJ Fogg, who's a professor at Stanford University, is the one who makes this distinction. And he describes it as hot triggers are triggers that can be acted upon right away. Cold triggers cannot. So for example, if you're driving down the road and you see a billboard and it says, go visit jamesclear.com, that's actually a cold trigger. You're driving right now, you can't act on it right away. Whereas if I sent you a text message, for example, I could say, hey, check out this new article on jamesclear.com. Here's the link. You could click on that immediately. That's a hot trigger that can be acted upon. So cold triggers cannot be acted upon right away. Hot triggers can. And hot triggers are really essential for driving behavior. So this is the quote from Professor Fogg. He says, put hot triggers in the path of motivated people. To him, that is kind of the core of how to change behavior. If you give someone a trigger that they can act on right away, and they're motivated to do it, this is motivation is stage 2, right? It's the desire piece. You want to do it. Give somebody a trigger they can act on, and they have the desire, then immediately the action will follow. And so this is what we're looking for when we try to trigger new habits. All right, let's go ahead and make this really, really practical now. So there's an exercise. I'm just going to explain it to you now. You can use it anytime in the future and after we get off the call. But I'm going to walk you through how to use this so that we can build better habits into our own lives. So I call this a T-chart exercise because you're simply going to draw a big T on the paper. So one line across the top, one line down the middle. And in column 1, the column on the left, you're going to list all of the things that you do each day without fail. So for example, brush your teeth, put your shoes on, take a shower, sit down for lunch, get into bed, turn the light on, turn the light off. This is, usually there's a large batch of behaviors in the morning around our morning routine. There's usually another batch at work. Once we get in, we have a little routine to start our day. There's usually a batch around lunch, another batch around dinner, and then your kind of like power down or nightly routine when you're getting ready to go to bed. Those are kind of the major areas, but then obviously we have habits throughout the day as well. If you really want to get into this, I would encourage you to be very detailed with that list, right? Maybe you can come up with 100 things. Now, spend however much time on it that you want. But the more detailed that you are, the more helpful it will be for this next step that we're going to talk about for building the habit into your life. So that's column 1. Column 2 is going to list all of the things that happen to you each day without fail. So these are just kind of, you can think of them as triggers that you come across in your life. So for example, the sun rises, the sun sets, a traffic light turns green, a traffic light turns red, a commercial comes on the television, an advertisement comes on the radio, you get a text message. These are all things that are, going to be happening to you that you can kind of rely on being in your normal day. Now, once we have these 2 comprehensive lists, the one list of things that you do and the other list of things that happen to you, then I want you to think about the habit that you want to build into your life, and you're going to stack that new habit onto one of these triggers that's already happening. So for example, let's say you want to build a meditation habit, and every morning you make a cup of coffee or tea or whatever. You could say, when I make my morning cup of coffee, then I'll meditate for 60 seconds. Or when I set the cup into my coffee maker, I'll meditate for 30 seconds, whatever it is, right? So you're going to tie the new behavior to the current trigger in your life. And as you do that, as you think about how to organize that, one thing I want to say is that triggers work best when they're incredibly specific. So for example, a couple months ago, I was going to add a push-up habit to my like kind of lunchtime routine. So I was going to do push-ups like when I took a break for lunch. So I could say something general like that, like when I take a break for lunch, I'll do 15 push-ups. But instead, that's like pretty general. What does that mean? Does it mean I do the push-ups like at the beginning? Do I eat lunch first and then I do them? Do I, take a break in the middle? Instead, to be very specific, I could say when I close my laptop to take a break for lunch, then I'll do 15 push-ups. And the point here is that the more specific the trigger is, the less ambiguous it is about when to perform the new habit or behavior. All right, so that's the main thing about triggers. Try to make them hot triggers that you can act on right away, and very specific so that you can remember when to do them. And if you stack your triggers onto behaviors that are already happening, you find that it's a little bit easier to layer them into your life. And what's interesting is that you can start to build what I call these habit stacks, where you have, for example, when I make my morning cup of coffee, then I meditate for 60 seconds. After I meditate for 60 seconds, then I write out my to-do list for the day. After I write out my to-do list for the day, you get the idea, right? So we're building on each one. So you can kind of like come up with a really structured morning routine where one behavior leads right into the next, and that momentum kind of carries you through the stack. All right, so that's the first step for building better habits. First stage, triggers. Triggers get us to notice something, and that leads to a desire, a want to do that. Now, what's interesting about the desire is that there's been some really interesting research that has come out recently in the last few years, last 5 years or so. And the research has made the distinction between wanting something and liking something. For a long, long time, for decades, researchers thought that dopamine was the molecule, was the hormone that made you like things, that led to enjoyment, and it was that enjoyment that led you to do something. But let's go back to that cookie example that I mentioned earlier. So if I see a cookie on a counter, the very first time that I eat a cookie, the first cookie I ever have in my life, I eat it and it tastes great. In that case, the dopamine spike in your brain comes after eating the cookie. So there is this reward that follows the behavior. But as soon as that happens the first time, the brain is very, very good at remembering where that reward came from. And so it starts sequencing all of these little cues in the environment, all the triggers that it sees, and remembering those so that it can come back to that behavior in the future. So for example, as soon as I take a bite of that cookie and I notice this is really good, I like that reward, the brain thinks, what came beforehand? I saw the cookie on the counter. And so now that trigger starts to cue a desire for that reward. So the second time or the third time or the 300th time that I come across and I see a cookie, now I see it and it triggers this desire, this craving for it, right? The behavior has been conditioned. And what's really interesting is that the researchers have found that the dopamine spike in that case does not come after you bite the cookie, it comes before. It's actually the craving that is triggered, that triggers the dopamine. It's the wanting of it rather than the liking of it. And so the desire is actually the thing that drives you to take action. And then you take the action and that the dopamine actually drops at that point. It's more of like you satisfied the craving and that was the thing that drove the action. So as behaviors become more and more conditioned, the desire becomes more and more important. And what's interesting is that we often see this in, let me give you two different extreme examples. So on the first hand, you start to do something and the more and more you do it, the less and less you desire it. If I eat one cookie, but then I start to eat 10 or 20 or 30, and then you're like, oh, I don't even want to eat anymore, right? It kills the desire. And now you have no reason for acting. The reward is actually the same, but the desire is no longer there. And then on the opposite end, let's take someone who falls into some kind of drug addiction, for example. What researchers find is that after someone gets addicted, what becomes the highlight of the addiction is satisfying the craving. In many cases, scoring the drugs and being able to buy them and purchase them so that they have them is actually more desirable than the outcome of taking the drugs. They find that often people they realize that they're kind of wrecking themselves. They feel guilty afterward. They don't enjoy it, but they enjoy the desire. It's the craving that drives the habit. You'll hear people say this about pornography addiction as well, right? They have this cue, this trigger, and then it causes them to want it. They desire it, but then afterward they feel guilty and shameful. So what's interesting is that the more that habits get ingrained into our lives, we find that desire is the thing that drives that long-term behavior. So how can we ramp up desire in a practical way? Like, we understand how this works for addiction or, for bad habits like craving a cookie, but what about for good habits? What about for things that we want to build into our lives? How do we ramp up the amount of desire? And what's interesting is that we have this great tool at our disposal for doing that, and it's visualization and goal setting. The more that we visualize exactly what an outcome is like, the more that you try to make that outcome tangible in your brain, the more that you desire it. Imagine having a very messy desk in front of yourself, and you're not allowed to touch it. This is a great example that this guy named PJ Eby uses. And he says, you're not allowed to touch anything on this messy, cluttered desk, but I want you to visualize in the most extreme detail how to clear that desk, what it would look like clean, how that would feel. And what you find is that when you start to envision this change over and over again, you're like, God, I just got to move this stuff. I got to clean this stuff out of here, because you can see the future so vividly. And so you can ramp up desire by increasing visualization and specific goal setting the more clear you are about the outcome that you want to achieve. There are hundreds of studies that show this, and they use the term implementation intentions. And so implementation intentions have been used to increase the odds that people will do things like start exercising, begin recycling, stick with studying, even stop smoking. And let me give you a little example of how to actually use this. So during the next week, let me set the stage first. So researchers brought these people in, and they had them look at different exercise habits. They said, we want you to track how often you exercise over the next 2 weeks. That was the goal, okay? And they had 3 different groups. The first group, they said, just track how often you exercise. That's all that they did. So they were the control group. The second group, they said, track how often you exercise, but also we want you to watch this presentation. And it was a very motivating presentation about the benefits of exercise and why exercise was good for heart health. And they got some additional papers and pamphlets on it. So the goal of this group 2, was to be the motivated group. They had a good reason to exercise. Then there was the third group. And the third group was exactly the same as the second group. So they were equally motivated. They got the same presentation, the same information. But then they asked them to do one thing that the other 2 groups did not do. And that one thing was fill out this sentence and said, during the next week, I will partake in at least 20 minutes of vigorous exercise on this day, at this time, in this place. So this is called an implementation intention, because it states the specific way that you will implement the behavior that you want to perform, right? And what they found was that the control group, group 1, worked out about 38% of the time. The motivated group, as soon as they walked out of the room, the motivation dropped. It did nothing to change long-term behavior. Again, about a third of them worked out. But the group that wrote down when and where they were going to perform the behavior were 3 times more likely to do it, right? They were 3 times more likely to follow through. And what's interesting here is that you specifically state when and where you're going to do something. You not only ramp up the desire to do that, you can see it in your mind, what it's going to be like to execute, but you also overcome the vague, fuzzy fog of how you're going to make this happen, right? You're able to state specifically how the action will occur. And so when you explicitly state when, where, and how you will implement your habits, you end up getting closer to the action, which is the third step. And so this is the step that I think is, it's not surprising, but we often overlook it. And I want to make this point really clear. We often overlook how small our habits need to be. Even if you know that small steps lead to success, we often find that we bite off more than we can chew. And the more that you ramp up this desire in stage 2, the more inspired you are to do something really big in stage 3, to take a huge action. And we often find that self-help gurus and experts and stuff, they talk about how the only way to achieve great results is to take massive action. And I think that this, first of all, I think it overlooks how most change actually happens in human life. Think about your bad habits, for example. Did you take massive action to make them bad? It really was like the summary of 1,000 small bad decisions day in and day out that accumulated into something much more. It wasn't that you made one grave mistake in your life and that ended up forming all these bad habits. It actually was the accumulation of many small choices. And if that's how it works on the bad side, it would make sense that it would work the opposite way on the good side, right? That we would take many, many small actions that are slightly better, and that's how we would change our behavior for the good. So the key point about actions then is that the smaller they are, the more effective they are. And I would like to share a little trick or strategy that I call the 2-minute rule. And this is like an adapted version from this guy named David Allen. David Allen wrote this book called Getting Things Done. It's a productivity book. And his version of the 2-minute rule says, if something takes less than 2 minutes, then just do it now. So it's like a productivity hack, right? Like if it takes less than 2 minutes, take out the trash, just do it now. Don't plan when to do it. Don't wait and debate about it. Just do it right away. If you have this phone call that you need to return that's been sitting there for a week, just do it now. If you need to respond to an email or wash the dishes after finishing your meal, just do it right away. Now, I think we can adapt this for motivation for a habit. So for example, whenever you're starting a new behavior, people often complain about procrastination, right? And what we find is that what's interesting is it's often the hardest, the biggest friction point in building a better habit is at the very beginning of the habit, not once you've started. So we think about this behavior and we procrastinate on it as if it will be very difficult to do, but it often is easier to be in the middle of the work, in the middle of the habit, than it is to be in the middle of procrastination. It's almost like the habit is less difficult to perform, but there's this spike, right? There's this friction point at the top, and that's the friction of getting started. So for example, take going for a run, like you get home from work, you want to go for a 2 or 3 mile run, but you find that you're feeling exhausted at the end of the day. The hardest part is getting your shoes on and getting out the door. Once you've started running, once you're a mile in, for example, it's not that hard to finish at that point. Now you're down here at the bottom of this curve, right? You're like, well, I'm a mile in. I might as well finish the run. I'm already out here. And so the point of the 2-minute rule for habit change is that not all habits can be performed in less than 2 minutes, but pretty much any habit can be started in less than 2 minutes. And the goal of the action step is to focus entirely on those first 2 minutes of beginning a behavior and trusting that a cascade of good results will come from there. So the key idea here is that make it so easy you can't say no, right? And this is a great quote from Leo Babauta, but what would be the size of a habit that would actually be like silly to not do? Rather than coming home and worrying about running for 3 miles, what if the whole goal of the habit was to fill up your water bottle, put on your running shoes, and step out the door? And as soon as you close the door, the habit's actually done. If you want to walk back inside, then it's not a big deal. You don't have to worry about failure. That's fine. You did what you needed to do. But what you often find is that, of course, once you begin the behavior, the steps follow naturally. Now, I want to make one point about this because many of you might be like me, which is if I heard a strategy like that, I know what my brain would do. I would immediately say, all right, look, I get what you're saying. Small habits, like getting started, will probably lead to me like finishing things, but I'm not just going to trick my brain into thinking this because I actually know what I'm trying to do, right? I actually know that I want to run 3 miles. I don't want to just step out the door. And if you find yourself like doubting that strategy for that reason, or like shooting holes into why this wouldn't work, I would encourage you to do something a little counterintuitive. And that is to actually not go for the run, to actually set, so often we set a lower limit for our behavior. We think, I want to run at least 3 miles, but if I do more, then that's great. I want to answer at least 25 emails, and if I get more done, then that's great. I want to make at least 6 figures this year, but if I make more, then that's preferred. And so this lower limit, this lower threshold for success, the problem with it is that we're focused on achieving as much as possible, as often as possible, and not on showing up. And so what I would like to encourage you to do is to do the opposite. Set an upper bound for your behavior. So for example, let's go back to the exercise example. I had a reader he was 100 pounds overweight and he wanted to lose weight. And so he started by going to the gym, and his habit was, I have to go to the gym 5 days a week, but I'm not allowed to stay for more than 5 minutes. So he literally would walk in the door, like walk around for a minute or two, and then look at his watch, and it'd be 5 minutes. He'd go back up and go into his car and drive away. And the point here was after like 4 or 6 weeks, he started being like, man, I'm coming here all the time. I might as well stay a little bit longer, right? I might as well like figure out what kind of workout to do or whatever, make this time effective. And so often we try to optimize before we standardize. We're worried about optimizing this 3 mile run when we haven't even figured out how to standardize it, how to make sure that we actually show up and put our running shoes on every day. And so I would say focus on the art of showing up first, set that upper limit for yourself. And once you've proven that you can actually get your shoes on and fill your water bottle up and walk out the front door and do that for 4 weeks in a row, every single night, or however often you want to do this each week, then you can worry about shooting holes in the argument and thinking about how you actually want to run for 3 miles, because at that point you've mastered the art of showing up. And so often we try to optimize things without figuring out how to make sure that we show up day in and day out. So that's something that I know I fall victim to. So if you find yourself falling victim to that, then I'd just like to encourage you to think about it that way too. All right, so that's stage 3, action. Let's make the action small. Final stage, rewards. So why do we do something in the first place? Why do we even perform habits and behaviors? Why do we remember what we do? So let's break this down from an evolutionary standpoint. From an evolutionary argument, all living organisms require resources to survive. For the case of humans, we require food, water, shelter, and safety. And in order to get those resources, we need to remember what they are and where they are. If you're walking around and you find, for example, let's say it's 100,000 years ago and you're walking around in the savannah and you come across a watering hole, you need to remember where that is so that you can come back and get water when you need it. And so what ended up happening over the course of evolution is that humans were selected for based on their ability to remember, to identify these cues in their environment that signaled where rewards and resources lie. And so the humans that were better at remembering where the water hole was, or picking out the patterns that showed, oh, there's actually a line in the bush or whatever, were the ones that were more likely to survive. And so we are deeply, primally, instinctually wired to spot rewards and remember where those things are in our lives. So whether it's a cookie on the counter or where we need to go to avoid some type of what we need to do to stay safe in our tribe, we remember where rewards are. It's deeply wired into us. So what's interesting from a habit standpoint is that rewards that are more immediate are much more strongly valued than rewards that are long-term. This also makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. I would rather value food that is in front of me right now, or water that is in front of me right now, than water in a month, right? So this is a concept that's called temporal discounting or timing consistency. And what we find is that there's two selves, right? So let's say you're laying in bed at the end of the night and you're thinking about, I'm so tired of blah, blah, blah result, right? Whether it's not making enough money or not being, being overweight or not being happy or not being in a relationship or whatever it is, right? We have all these things that we think about. And when you think about your future self lying there in bed at night, you're thinking, all right, tomorrow's the day that I'm going to, ask her out on a date or go to the gym or, I'm going to start meditating and take control of my life. I'll join a yoga class, whatever. And when you think about your future self, you actually do genuinely want to achieve those results. But when it comes time the next day to take the action, what we find is that the present self highly values immediate reward, not long-term reward. So when you envision your future self, yeah, I would like to be healthy in a year. Yes, I would like to be in a happy relationship a year from now. It's very easy to understand why the delayed gratification, why the long-term reward is good for your future self. But for the present self, the brain is wired from an evolutionary standpoint to value immediate reward higher. And so rather than going to the gym, we choose to eat the donut because we value the immediate reward, the kick of sugar in the moment, rather than the long-term reward of losing weight 4 weeks from now or 20 weeks from now or 2 years from now. And this is one of the challenges of habits, right? Bad habits, they tend to be easier to rationalize because they give you an immediate reward right away, and the long-term outcome is kind of delayed, right? You eat a donut now, it tastes good in the moment, but you don't really gain much weight. The scale doesn't change. But then you repeat that for 4 months or 4 years, and suddenly the scale is very different. And for for good habits, it's the opposite story. You study, Chinese for 1 hour now, you still haven't learned the language. You go to the gym for 3 days this week, you still haven't necessarily changed your body. And so the delayed reward is the successful reward is delayed, and the immediate reward is punishment for good habits, and it's the opposite for bad. And that's one of the challenges of sticking to good behaviors and breaking bad ones, is that we have to figure out how to wrestle with this immediate reward versus this delayed reward. All right, so the point here is that the brain values long-term benefits when they're in the future, but it values immediate gratification when it's in the moment. And there are some very interesting stories. We unfortunately don't have time to get into all of them right now, but just some quick examples of companies that have figured out a way to pull an immediate reward into the moment for something that actually has a delayed reward. So take, for example, washing your hands. In a lot of countries, like for example, there's great campaigns in Ghana and India that found that people weren't washing their hands as much as they needed to, and so that ended up resulting in them getting sick. But again, here's, if the bad habit in the moment is you don't wash your hands after you go to the bathroom, but the delayed reward, or the delayed punishment in this case, is, weeks or months later, you end up getting sick, but you don't tie the two together. And so what they ended up doing was they designed soap that really lathered very well. It was like really enjoyable to use. It felt good. It's, there were lots of suds and bubbles, and it was just enjoyable. And so by doing that, they tied an immediate reward of using the soap, and it aligned the immediate reward and the long-term reward. And so we have to think about ways to do that for our habits as well. All right, so the key point here is the present self is wired for instant gratification, not long-term rewards. And if you can figure out how to bring those immediate rewards into the present moment, you're more likely to stick with good habits. And I'd just like to pause for a minute here and say that this is another reason why identity-based habits, which we talked about at the beginning of this call, can be incredibly useful and beneficial because, take, for example, the exercise habit again. Rather than worrying about there is no immediate gratification for some people of, going to the gym. It just feels hard. It's actual work. But if you are focused on becoming the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, if you're focused on building that identity, then doing the action is the reward. The reward becomes instant and immediate because by following through on the type of person that you want to be, the reward is there. And so that's just another reason why identity-based habits help foster that long-term sense of consistency that, that leads us to stick with good habits. All right, so part 4, failure. It doesn't matter who you are or how well you know those 4 stages of habits, right? Trigger, desire, action, reward. Doesn't matter how well you understand habits or even honestly how disciplined you are. All of us are going to fail at some point. I have done it. Everybody else has done it. It's just part of the game. And so first we need to abandon this all or nothing mentality. This idea that if I can't do something 100%, then I shouldn't do it at all. It's a very common notion we talk about all the time. It's like people start a diet and they stick to it for a week and then they miss one meal and they're like, oh, I blew my diet. As if doing something for 6 out of 7 days wouldn't be more beneficial than doing it for 0 out of 7 days, right? This idea that doing something even just 1 day a week that you weren't doing previously, that it's no longer beneficial, is a myth that we repeat to ourselves over and over again. And so I like for us to first abandon that, right? So the second thing is, how can we make our habits more resilient from the start? Is there a plan that we can use, understanding that we are going to fail? How can we, set ourselves up for success? All right. So the best way to do this is with simple if-then planning. So I had you do that failure pre-mortem at the beginning of this call, right? Where we wrote down exactly why and when you would go off course, write the story of how your habits failed. Well, now that you have that in front of you for the things that took you off course, think about how you can come up with if-then scenarios for the different things that might take you off track. So for example, if I eat fast food for lunch, then I'll stop by the store and buy vegetables for dinner. Or if I haven't called my mom back by 7 p.m., then I won't turn on the TV until I do. Or if my meeting runs over and I don't exercise today, then I'll wake up early tomorrow and run. And I'll also say we're starting to get toward the second half of the presentation now, where things start to layer on each other. So for example, you can also see how implementation intentions can be really useful here, right? So let's say you have an implementation intention where you explicitly state when and where you're going to work out. So for example, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'll go to the gym at 6 p.m. Well, then if we have this third scenario, if my meeting runs over and I don't exercise this afternoon, then you already have a plan implemented for when you're going to execute on that exercise habit, right? You could say, well, I know that if I miss on Monday, then I'll work out on Wednesday at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or whatever you have written down. And so the implementation intention also becomes a way to rebound from failure. All right, so the key point I want to make here, though, is that planning to fail does not mean expecting to fail. Failure is not the goal, right? Failure should be rare, but it should also be learned from and prevented as much as possible. So rather, the goal here is to realize that nobody is going to be perfect. So this helps you know how to get back on track when things don't work out. And what I found is that the more that I research top performers and high achievers, and honestly, pretty much any industry, what we find is that top performers fail just as often as average ones. The difference is they get back on track more quickly. So they have just as many things in their life that pull them off course or that distract them, but they figure out a way to get back on track as fast as possible. And the philosophy that I like to keep in mind here is never miss twice. So if you fall off with your habit once, that's fine. It's not a big deal, but put all of your effort into getting back on track the very next time that you need to. So never miss twice. It's fine if you miss once, but just get back on track quickly. Okay, we have now made it through the portion of the presentation where we've covered a lot of the influences that are, under our control or at least closely related to us. And we're going to continue this inside out methodology. And so now we're going to talk about environment, which is an external force that significantly impacts our behavior. In order to do this, I want to share a concept that it's called choice architecture, and I like the phrase designing for laziness. So here's the story that I like. So this is from a research study that was done at Harvard, and this is a very rough drawing of the cafeteria at Massachusetts General Hospital. So what we have here is you walk into the cafeteria, and around the cafeteria, around the edge, there's all these different stations that have food and water. The two dark little squares on either side, those are refrigerators that have water in them. The shaded red or pink boxes, those are refrigerators that have like soda and juice and other options in them. And then we have the cashier's table there at the top. So I'm going to flip back and forth here to show you some of the changes that the researchers at Harvard made to this cafeteria. So this is what it looked like at first. This is what they did. So I'll go back and forth here a couple times. Now, it's important to note that the shaded boxes that turned into these dark boxes, they still have soda and juice in them. They just added water to the option. And then they also, these little circles that are being added, those are some of those little rolling carts that have like, different, rolling like a water bin or whatever. And those have water available too. So the moral of the story here is the only thing they changed is that they changed the amount of water that was presented throughout the room, right? They made it more available. They put it on the rolling carts, they added it to all the refrigerators and so on. And they didn't tell anybody anything. They didn't say anything to workers, anything to the people eating there. And what they found was that over the next few months, the amount of water sales increased 25% and the amount of soda sales decreased 12%. Now, this is very interesting, right? Because if we were to ask somebody, why are you drinking what you're drinking? A lot of them would say something like, well, I really wanted to have a soda, or I enjoy orange juice, or whatever. But the truth is, many of these people purchased what they wanted to drink simply because it was presented to them, not because they actually wanted it, but because they were triggered to buy it. So this again comes back to that first cycle of the habit. Now, the point here to translate this to general stuff for our life is I've never seen someone consistently stick to positive habits in a negative environment. If you are consistently offered negative stimuli, negative triggers, negative cues, it's very hard to overcome those time and time again and stick with positive habits. But if you can adjust your environment so that you're presented with positive cues time and time again, it becomes much easier to make a good default decision. If we, to use this phrase again, design for laziness, then we find that it's easier for us, our lazy decision, to follow through. So one more example of this, BJ Fogg, that professor at Stanford that I mentioned previously, he enjoyed eating popcorn. He likes popcorn, but he just wanted to eat less of it. And so he took the popcorn out of his pantry, walked down the hallway to his garage, and put it on the highest shelf in the garage. And if he really wants the popcorn, he can just go out and get it. It's only going to take 60 seconds. He's just got to go out there, get a ladder, climb up and get it. But if he's designing for his default decision, for his lazy action, he's not going to go out and get the popcorn. And that's the main idea here with environment design, which is how can we restructure the kitchen that we eat in, the desk that we work from, the spaces that we live and work in each day, so that the good decisions are easier and have fewer steps between us and them, and the bad decisions are harder and have further steps. An interesting little example from my own life, I've noticed that if I have like a 6-pack of beer and it's sitting in the fridge and it's like toward the front and it's in a visible location, then dinner will roll around and I'll pull a beer out and drink it just because it's there. But if I have a 6-pack of beer and it's tucked into the back corner of the fridge so that I can't really see it, I got to kind of like bend down and look and it's not obvious, I've literally had it sit there for like 2 months without me drinking it. So what's going on here? Like I don't really desire it, I don't crave it without seeing it, but if it's triggered, then I immediately grab it. And so if we can readjust the triggers in our environment to make those good behaviors easier and bad behaviors harder, you'll find that your behavior and your habits often follow suit automatically. All right, we're getting near the end here. So feedback. This is an incredibly essential part, and it ties directly to the reward component of behavior. Quick little story. There's this guy named Trent Dursmid, and back in the early 90s, he was a recent college grad. He was working as a stockbroker in Abbotsford, Canada, which was a little, little suburb of Vancouver at the time. wasn't nearly as big as it is today, and it certainly was not known for its, financial prowess or the level of success that it had in stock, as for stockbrokers or in the financial industry. And so, anyway, first job out of school for Trent, and his boss comes to him and says, "Trent, I want you to, do the best you can. Like, here's your book of business. Here's your call list. Like, try to figure this out and see how you can do." And over the next couple of years, Trent ended up becoming the top performer in his department, and he was able to leverage his performance into a huge job. He had a $5 million book of business and $200,000 a year in salary in the mid 90s as a young 20-something. And the way that he did it was by a simple little strategy. He had 2 cups in front of him each day, 2 little bins on his desk. And in the first bin, he had 120 paper clips. And when I interviewed him, he said, every morning I would start with 120 paper clips in one jar, and I would keep dialing the phone until I had moved them all to the second jar. So make a call, move the paper clip over. Make a call, move the paper clip over. And what's interesting here is that there's a bigger conversation we could have about how, any task or any field, any industry has some core function, some core fundamentals that actually make the biggest difference. Like Trent, for example, wasn't reading analyst reports. He didn't check in with his peers to see how they were doing or what they thought was hot or not. He wasn't watching the news to figure out what stocks were going up or down. He was just making sales calls, because sales calls were the most fundamental part of achieving success in that role. But the other piece is that he had this system for developing feedback, for getting actual immediate feedback on whether or not he was achieving success. So often we live life in this gray area where we don't really know whether we're doing well or not. We think we're doing pretty good. You ask someone, "Oh, how's your diet been going?" "Oh, pretty good. Like, I've been sticking to it." But in reality, we all lie to ourselves about like how healthy we're eating or not. And the reason is that we don't have good, clear, black or white, yes or no, right or wrong feedback about whether or not we're sticking with something. And in this case, Trent actually had that, because he had visual feedback on his desk. Like, how many calls did he make? If he had only made 20 calls that morning, he knows, because there's still 100 paper clips in this other jar. So one of the lessons is that behavior is often a result of what is reinforced or what is punished. What is measured gets managed is the famous quote from Peter Drucker, right? And this is one way of measuring your behavior in the moment to make sure that you're actually following through. All right, let me give you an example of how to do this over the long run. So Jerry Seinfeld, one of the most famous comedians of his generation, and he early in his career, he's doing stand-up. His show has been out for maybe a year or two, and he's headlining at this comedy club when, as the story goes, there's this young comic named Brad Isaac who is opening for Seinfeld that night. And Brad Isaac catches Seinfeld backstage, and he says, "Mr. Seinfeld, big fan of your work. I'm wondering if you have any tips for a young comic." And Seinfeld thinks for a second, and he said, "Well, the secret to being a better comic is to write better jokes. And the secret to writing better jokes is to write every day. So here's what I think you should do. Get a big wall calendar where you can map out every day of the year on there. And I want you to, each day that you do your task of writing jokes for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it is, I want you to put an X on that day, right? Get a Sharpie and write an X off that day. Now, you might have a few days where you have a couple false starts, maybe you do 2 or 3 in a row or whatever. But at some point, you're going to get a chain going, 5, 6, 7, 8 days in a row. And at that point, your only goal becomes to not break the chain. Just don't break the chain. Doesn't matter how good or how bad the work is. Doesn't matter how you feel about it. It doesn't matter if it makes it into the material or not. Your only goal is don't break the chain. And I like to throw in that second caveat to this, which is never miss twice, right? You start to have these chains going together in your life. And if you do miss one day, that's fine. Immediately start the next chain, right? Get back on track right away. And what you find is that if you can do this, it's a great, the paperclip strategy and moving those paper clips over to each jar is a useful strategy for sticking to daily behaviors. The Seinfeld strategy, and not missing twice, is great for sticking to long-term behaviors, right? It's maintaining that long-term consistency. And you can use this idea for all kinds of things. You can, I have friends who are video editors who every day that they do their 30 minutes of video editing, they put an X on that day. I have a friend who is a coach at a gym, and every day that he works out, put an X on that day, right? You can do it for writing. If you want to write a new article every Monday, then your goal is to have a chain all the way down the Mondays, the whole calendar of the year, right? And so you can adapt this however you want, but the idea is never miss twice and don't break the chain. So what we're really building here are feedback loops, right? We want to get feedback on whether or not we're following through on the habits that are important to us. And just to wrap up this presentation with a few more examples, one great example of feedback are those "your speed is" signs. I don't know if you've driven and seen those where you're going down the road and it's, a little radar on the side of the road and it says, 35-mile-an-hour zone, you're going 42, right? Or it's flashing or whatever. And so the idea here is it gives you immediate feedback on what you're doing. And that feedback causes you to change your behavior. It's a trigger for the next action. And so this is an important thing for sticking to habits over the long run. We often have triggers for our first action, but we don't have recurring triggers for every other action that needs to follow, right? To stick with the habit. That's where the paperclip strategy and the Seinfeld strategy follow through. So what research has found is that these "your speed is" signs, those little radars, they tend to improve behavior by about 10%. People reduce their speed by about 10%. They stick with it for miles down the road, and you tend not to get fatigued by them. If you see it now, you know that it's working, but if you see one 6 months from now, it'll probably still work and you'll still slow down by about 10% or so. Here are some other examples of feedback loops. So I have a friend who he wanted to assume better posture, so he wanted to sit up straight. And posture is one of those really annoying things to try to build as a habit, right? Like you can think about it in the moment, but as soon as you start a conversation or doing anything else, your shoulders begin to slouch, you forget about it. So what he did is in the beginning of the day, when he assumed good posture, he would put a piece of tape across his shoulder. So anytime his shoulder would slouch, it would tug a little bit. And so that was enough feedback for him to, try to keep his shoulders back. Another one is an outlet timer. You can buy these on Amazon for like $8. And you just plug the outlet timer into the wall and you set it for a time, let's say 10 p.m. And if you want to go to bed, if you find yourself staying up too late every night, you're like, oh gosh, it's 1 a.m. again, like I should have went to bed 3 hours ago, then you can set these outlet timers up. And at 10 p.m., it'll automatically kill the power from that outlet. And what's great about that is it's just a feedback loop, right? It's just a signal, a trigger to you that says, look, you said this was important to you. It's time to go to bed now. Eco dashboard lights. So for example, my car, if I'm driving efficiently, if I'm not accelerating too fast, driving crazy, then the dashboard will light up green. If I am accelerating too fast, the green fades away. So that's a little feedback loop of how to, how to stay more consistent with good driving habits. And then my favorite one is this thing called the glow cap. And it's this little cap that goes on top of prescription medication bottles. And so you put it on the bottle, and let's say you're supposed to take your medication at like 8 a.m. Well, if it gets to 8 a.m. and you haven't taken it yet, then the cap will start to glow a little bit and like catch your attention. If it's like 8:10 and you still haven't taken it, then it starts to pulse, right? A little more noticeable. If it gets to 8:15, you haven't taken it, it sends you a text message and says, hey, take your medication, right? And so these are great examples. It's like an escalating feedback loop. You get more and more feedback. The feedback gets more and more intense the longer you go without doing the behavior. And this is a great general principle to keep in mind for feedback. The more intense the feedback, the more likely we are to notice it. And the more likely we are to notice it, the more likely it is to trigger a habit. So in Seth Godin's terms, the best way to change long-term behaviors is short-term feedback. I'm not sure if it's the best way, but it's a very good way. And feedback is an essential thing for building better habits. So that takes us to the end of the presentation. So we're going to start Q&A now. Before we do, I want to offer a few additional resources. So I write weekly articles about habits and human potential. Those are available at jamesclear.com. I also have a reading list on a wide range of topics, not just about habits, but philosophy, psychology, all kinds of stuff. So if you want to check those out, you can look at those at jamesclear.com/bestbooks. And I also have a masterclass, which is kind of my premium course on how to build habits that last. And that's available at jamesclear.com/masterclass. So anyway, feel free to check those out if you want. And as we dive into Q&A now, I see there are a couple questions have been submitted throughout the conversation, so that's great. Thank you for sending those in. I also have 3 that were submitted beforehand from you all, so I'll just start by answering those, and then we'll get into more and more. As I'm answering these, if you have other questions that come up, feel free to go ahead and submit them through Q&A or through the chat. Okay, so first question that someone threw in: how do you identify and eliminate bad habits rapidly? Very good question. The best way to change behavior in a rapid fashion is to change your environment. I would say it's almost the only way to change behavior rapidly. So take, for example, this often happens around like big life decision points. So for example, you get married, you have a kid, you move to a new city, you graduate college, and you take a new job. Any of these things are radical life changes, right? You're starting a completely new job, you're living in a completely different place, you have a new person in your family, you're married to somebody new and you move in together. These are radical changes to your environment. And often you find that a whole new set of behaviors and habits comes with those changes. And the key, and the reason that radical change works in those situations, and it often doesn't in everyday life, and why I advocate starting very small and having small actions, is that in those situations, the radical change is something you can't get out of. Generally speaking, it's very hard to, get rid of a baby or get divorced or move to a different city after you just moved somewhere or quit your job, right? Like these are situations that have a lot of friction associated with changing them. And because they are permanent, the radical change in our environment leads to radical changes in behavior. And to give you a bad habits example, during the Vietnam War, there was a really serious heroin addiction problem for American troops. It was to the point where like 15 to 20% of American troops in Vietnam were trying heroin, using heroin. And what they ended up finding was that, shockingly, when they brought them back, the relapse rate was incredibly low. It was like the normal relapse rate for heroin addicts. They go into rehab and they go back out like 90%. But for those in Vietnam, it was like 5%. And what they found was that it was all the environment that was triggering the behavior. It was the fact that they were surrounded by heroin, surrounded by other users in a war zone that was incredibly stressful. And as soon as they changed their environment in a radical way, their behavior changed radically as well. So that's the single best strategy you can use for doing that. Okay, what was the biggest change you noticed in your life and business from your understanding and application of habits? Good question. I think probably the biggest change is realizing how small behaviors exponentially add up over time. That it's very hard for the human brain to conceptualize how accumulation and exponential growth works. But take, for example, my writing. So for the first 4 years, for the first 3 years that I wrote on jamesclear.com, I wrote a new article every Monday and every Thursday. And simply sticking to that habit completely changed my life and my business. And what ended up happening was that the growth followed kind of that exponential curve. After the first month, I had, like 100 subscribers. After the first 3 months, I had like 1,000. After, 6 months, I had 6,000. And then in the 7th month, I added 6,000 more email subscribers. So I went from 6 to 12. And then by the end of that year, I had like 35. And by the end of the next year, I had 100. And then, so it's gone on and on and on. And now we're at, close to over 400,000 people on the list. So my point being that little small actions like that can add up in a really, really remarkable way that I think is very easy for us to overlook. And so I think the biggest change is that I recognize how every choice matters. And I don't say that in a way like there's no reason to stress out about that. There's no reason to worry about, oh my gosh, I can never make a mistake because every choice matters. It's just the point that each choice you make is casting a vote for the type of person that you want to be. It's casting a vote for the type of result or outcome that you want. And you don't have to win every vote. It doesn't have to be unanimous, but you do need to win a majority. And if you win a majority of the votes, if you cast a majority of the votes in the right direction for the right type of person you want to be, for the right type of outcome that you desire in your life, then those will often accumulate in a very significant way. Okay, so how do you keep going? With all that you do, how do you keep your energy levels up, stay on course? Thank you for your assumption that I've got all this going on and doing well. I think the biggest thing is that I don't know that I actually do a ton. I try to be much better about cutting out things and only doing the things that matter most to me. And that was very, very hard for me to do for the first couple years. It's become easier for me. I've gotten better at saying no, but now I'm at the point where I really only have like 1 or 2 core goals in my personal life and 1 or 2 core projects in my work life. And everything else is kind of on the back burner. And, you know, like it's on maintenance mode. And sometimes I like to think about things in that way, right? Like you can only have like 1 or 2 things that you can master, and then you have like 2 to 4 that you can maintain, and then the rest you just need to wait for a future date. All right, let's dive into some of these other questions. Let's see here. Okay, so some of the Q&A. How do we coach students on growing past the imposter syndrome? The idea that they're not good enough or they're still faking being a good programmer. Great question. So I'll just answer something that I was told when I first started writing, because I felt the same way, that I kind of like, who am I to write about these topics? Who am I to be an expert? And the answer that really resonated with me was, you become an expert by doing these things every day. So I became an expert on habits and human behavior by writing about it every week for 3 years, right? And at the end of that process, I actually was very good and well-versed in that, but it wasn't at the start. And so the point for them is that, look, imposter syndrome is, first, just let it be known that like this is normal. Everybody deals with this. And the only way to get past it is to show up enough that you actually have become an expert. And I like this analogy of like take animals, right? Like a wolf or something. Wolves they each have their territory, right? They have this space that is theirs, this region of the world that has become their own, where they feel comfortable. And what you find is that in the beginning of habits, in the beginning of some kind of behavior change, you rarely feel comfortable, right? Like the first time that you go to the gym, pretty much everybody feels like an imposter. You feel weak, you feel out of place, you don't feel like you belong, you feel like you're being judged. And so imposter syndrome was quite normal in the beginning. But if you continue to go to the gym 3, 4, 5 days a week and do that for, you know, a year or 2 years or 3 years, all of a sudden you turn around someday and you're like, I don't feel like an imposter anymore. Not only do I not feel like an imposter, but this feels like my territory, right? You start to feel like the wolf, that this is my geography. This is the place where I live. This is where I feel comfortable. And I think we all have had that experience in some area of our lives, right? We all have places that we do feel like are our territory. But for new things, for new habits, we don't feel like that yet, simply because we haven't spent enough time there. So I would say that those would be my main thoughts on that. Okay, a couple little questions I see coming in from multiple people. Will you have access to slides? Will this video be available? Jeremy can answer those better than I can, but I do believe, yes, you'll have access to the video and the slides once we get done. And I'll be sending them over to them so they can make sure, you know, to distribute those to you all. Let's see. When I make a decision, I put my best effort toward it, but I often find myself burning out and giving up later on. How do I avoid burnout while still putting my best effort towards something? Good question. So this is something I think all of us have experienced. If we try to like bite off more than we can chew in the beginning, it's like, okay, if I'm actually going to give my best effort, then that means I need to work really, really hard. And I would say a little bit of this is just a redefinition of what best effort looks like. So rather than giving your best effort in the moment, and like this is the whole workout to failure mentality rather than like workout consistently mentality. And so one way I like to think about exercise is the primary goal of this workout that I'm doing right now is to prepare me for the next workout. So if this workout, you know, makes me slightly better, is just a little bit beyond my normal, then it'll give my body the ability to adapt to the stimulus, and I'll be ready to work out the next time. I'll have recovered fully. I'll feel fresh and energized. The main goal of this workout is to prepare me for the next one. And I think you can apply that philosophy to all kinds of stuff, right? If you think, I'm going to put my best effort towards something, well, why don't you reframe it a little bit and think the main goal of this action is to prepare me for the next action, to set me up better for future success. So rather than working so hard that you burn yourself out, you work just hard enough to build yourself up. And that is a great way to utilize the consistency mindset to stick to long-term behavior rather than trying to bite off too much. Let's see here. I'm going to jump over to the chat because I see a couple coming in there.
Yeah, I see one from Maria. How to keep and strengthen our motivation in order to achieve our goals.
Yeah, so maintaining motivation is a really interesting topic. We could do a whole presentation just on that if we wanted. But I'll tell you a quick story and give you a little kind of mental construct for thinking about how to make motivation last. So let's imagine that you're a tennis player, right? And if you're an average tennis player like me or somebody else, then you walk onto the court and you're going to play Serena Williams or Roger Federer, one of the best players in the world. And what you find is that that's going to be, it might be fun and cool for a minute, but if they're playing seriously and you're playing seriously, it's going to get boring really quick because you're going to lose every point, right? You just get frustrated, you get upset. Conversely, if you step onto the court and you're playing, say, a 4-year-old, then also that's going to get really boring really fast. Like, they might be cute for a couple points, but if you're actually like trying to win a game, it's just going to be boring because you're not going to be challenged. But if you're playing someone who's about at your level, where you win about half the points and they win about half the points, what you end up finding is that is about the most motivating type of task that a human can engage in. And research has shown this, and I like to refer to it as the Goldilocks rule. And the Goldilocks rule, comes from this like can't be too cold, can't be too hot kind of idea. The Goldilocks rule says that the tasks that are most motivating for the human mind are the ones that are just on the edge of our abilities. So not too hard, not too easy, just enough to challenge us, just enough to make us improve. But don't ask us to do so much that we get burnout or that we get upset and frustrated, and don't ask us to do so little that we get bored. And so the idea here is to translate this to a practical mindset. I like to call it normal plus one. So take your normal behavior, whatever that is, and add 1 to it, right? 1%, $1, 1 rep more, whatever that happens to be, 1 sentence more. But find a small way to increase, just enough to challenge you to like move the bar forward, but not enough to actually, make you feel frustrated. I see a good question here about how many habits should someone work on at once? And then another question about identity-based habits, which I'll get to afterward. So how many habits to work on at once? Good question. Experts actually have differing opinions on this. So some researchers believe that you should build like multiple really, really small habits at once, like 2 or 3 or 4, because you're learning the skill of how to build habits. And that's a totally useful construct. I mean, I can't complain about that too much. But I think that in my experience, it's much better to build 1 habit at a time, because if you just focus on one, then you're much more likely to follow through and actually build that into your life. And I try to get to the point where, a habit is a conditioned behavior. It's a learned behavior. The more that you repeat it, the more conditioned it becomes, the more encoded in your brain it becomes, and the more it gets pushed toward the automatic non-conscious part of your brain, because it's just, like I said, it's automatic, like tying your shoes, right? And so what I like to focus on is how can I focus on just one habit and get that habit to become as automatic as possible. And once that one's automatic, then I'll transition to the next one that I'm going to focus on. So I would say 1 at a time. All right, the identity-based habits question is, if you're working on identity-based habits, how do you know if you've really implemented a habit, since identity is something that's being worked on every day? That's a good question. You're right. Our identity is being informed every day. It's constantly being informed by the behaviors that we perform. The person that we think we are is always in flux. It's always a result of how people respond to us, how we're acting. So yes, identity can be a fairly fluid thing, or it's always adjusting, I guess, a little bit. But what we find is that the more evidence you have for an identity, the more evidence you have for a certain type of belief, the more likely you are to believe it. So, if you have 10 years of history that says, I go to church every Sunday, then you're much more likely to adopt the identity of believing I'm a religious person, because you have so much backing that up. So I guess to answer your question, the way that I think about identity-based habits is that they are a lens through which to view your habits and goals. It's not necessarily about is this identity fixed at this point, but it's more of a better way to focus on the process that lies behind our success rather than the result itself. If all you're thinking about is the result, then it's easy to cut corners or cheat to try to achieve that. it's easy to get, to lose motivation once you've achieved the result, because then what's driving you on? But if you're focused on the identity, then it becomes more about, am I becoming the type of person I want to become? And that can be a pretty useful thing to hold on to long term. All right, I see a couple more coming in here. Let's see. How do you avoid becoming overloaded? Good question. So overwhelm was a really big reason why people don't follow through with habits. I think that on the one hand, it comes from this sense of this lack of control that we feel like we have in the modern world. We feel like we're not in control of our habits and behaviors, or somebody else is calling the shots for us. On the other hand, it comes from just having a lot to do. So if you do feel like you're in control and you feel like you have too much to do, then I would encourage you to use some of that Eisenhower box technique, or that rose bush metaphor, where we're trying to prune away the good ideas to make space for the great ones. That process will not be easy. I think so often people want change without change, right? They want their results to change, but they don't want to have to say, well, I need to get rid of certain things in my life, right? They don't want to have to change their life, but they want their life to be different. And those two things don't add up, right? It often means that we need to make hard choices. But if the other problem is what you're feeling, if you're feeling that you lack self-control, or that you don't get to call the shots, or that you're overwhelmed and overloaded by things that aren't under your personal agency or control, then I think that the Stoic philosophy is very helpful here. So Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, has a line near the beginning of his book, Manual for Living, which I think is a fantastic book, where he says, some things are within your power and some are not. And a lot of frustration and a lot of failure and a lot of anger has happened because people confused which one is which, right? We get upset and angry about things that are not within our control without necessarily realizing it. We root for sports teams, but have no control over the outcome. We want our life to change, but don't, we want deeply for people to think something different of us, but we have no control over what they think. And so the first thing is to take a step back and to realize that this is not something that is within my power, and it does not make sense to worry about it. The only goal that makes any logical sense in life is to try to master the things that are under your control. Now, once you have reached that level, once you say, okay, I've realized that this is not within my control, there's another interesting thing that can happen, which is you can shift and say, this part of the equation is not within my control, but I have a responsibility to always do something that is within my control to change the thing that I want to change. So I may not be able to control the outcome entirely, but I can control the aspect that I influence of that outcome. To take the tennis example, you can't control whether or not you win a tennis match, because it depends on how the ball bounces and how skilled your opponent is and the conditions of the court and a bunch of things that you don't control. But you can control how you approach each point, your mindset, how well you swing the racket. Your half of the equation, right? Your half of the court, you can control. What happens on the opponent's half, you cannot. So you can't control the full outcome, but you can control that. So that would be my suggestion if you're feeling overwhelmed. Let's see.
Time for probably one or two more, James, just heads up.
All right, let's do two more. Okay, so Stuart asked a follow-up question. Is it okay to reward yourself after doing something, or is that a bad way of training yourself? Should I just let the accomplishment of the task be the reward? Okay, this is a really interesting question, and I haven't completely made my mind up on this yet. What you find is that I actually was just talking to a researcher about this earlier this week. So let's take the example of a dog, right? So you tell a dog to sit, and you give it a treat for sitting, and you do this for a month or two, but then you take the treat away, and when you tell the dog to sit, the dog still sits. So in the beginning, supposedly the treat was the reward, but then you took the reward away, and the behavior still occurred. So what's going on there? I have two theories. The first is reinforcement, which is sort of what you're asking here. Like, should I reward myself to do something? Should I reinforce the behavior with a reward? Reinforcement is useful, especially in the beginning. Once the habit is conditioned, once it becomes the type of thing you do normally, then you can pull away the reinforcement and the habit still sticks. So for example, the really common one is people will be like, all right, if I work out, then I'll go get a milkshake or something like that, right? Well, maybe you get the milkshake for the first like 3 months of working out. And once you like haven't missed a workout and that becomes the normal thing you do, then you no longer have to worry about rewarding yourself for it because you've kind of like become that person. So that's one possible theory, is that once it gets conditioned, then you don't have to worry about as much. But my second theory, and the one that like it causes a little bit of friction with this, is that if we're going to believe in the identity-based habits thing, where we're like each action is casting a vote for the type of person that you want to become, then going to the gym casts a vote for I want to be a healthy person, but drinking a milkshake is not casting a vote for that new identity. So is that just a wash then? Like, does that actually make it harder for us to stick to that habit in the long run because we have kind of like conflicting actions? And so if it's possible, my suggestion would be reinforcement is great, but try to reinforce in a way that doesn't conflict with the very thing that you were trying to build with the habit. And so if you can do that, then I think, yeah, reinforcement and punishment can work quite well. And that's been proven time and time again that reinforcement does work for changing behavior. It's just how do we make it work for us rather than against us. All right, I'll pick one more question here. Let me just browse through real quickly. Okay, these are all great questions. I'm just going to pick one. Okay, so for someone who struggles to manage their time, would you say that it would be too ambitious to start planning every hour of every day? Yes, I would. And I actually think that there's some people are very planning oriented. And so that type of strategy might work well for you if you resonate with that. Like some people just love making to-do lists. It helps them make order of the world. And so that's fine. If that works, go ahead and do it. But if that is a struggle for you to manage your time, then I would say a better way to start would be with using what I call an anchor task. So an anchor task is one core behavior that you anchor the rest of your day around. So for example, when I was in college, I played baseball. And as a student athlete, baseball practice was like the one anchor in my day that it was going to happen. Like I had to be at the field from 3 to 6. And so once I knew that, then I could organize everything else in my day, meetings, when I was going to do homework, when I go to the library, when I hang out with friends, all that could be organized around that anchor task. And I would say that that'd be a really good way to start managing your time as well. Think about what that one core anchor task is that you need to stick to. Like, for example, for the first 3 years when I was writing a new article every Monday and Thursday, my anchor task was, look, it doesn't matter when that article gets done each day. It's just, this is the one thing that has to happen. And anything else that I do on top of that is just a bonus. So you can do that with working out, for example. And the one, I think it's a good way to start. The one caveat that I'll add to that is that you can really only do that with one thing. Because if you start to try to have 2 or 3 anchor tasks, then what happens when those come into conflict? Like what if your goal conflict is a big thing? Like what if you want to build a habit of sleeping for 8 hours every night, but you also want to build a habit of waking up at 6 a.m. and then you turn around one night and you find that it's midnight. And so like, which one is it? Are you going to sleep for 8 hours? Or are you going to wake up at 6? So you need to be very clear about what that prioritization is, but hopefully that can be an effective way to get started. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for having me on. I hope you all appreciated this, and yeah, it was great. I hope you found it useful. I enjoyed sharing it with you, and if you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. We had, I think we've still got over 80 people on right now, and we had over 105 at the max of this. So a lot of people were texting me and slacking me, and I will say that it seems like resoundingly you've dropped the mic, my friend.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We're excited about your book next year. And then I know everybody can probably, best way to contact you is just through your blog.
Yeah, there's a contact page on jamesclear.com. And yeah, if you want to check that out, feel free. And you're welcome to reach out to me there.
Fantastic, James. Thank you, sir. Everyone have a great, fantastic Sunday. And this will be recorded. So we'll share this with everyone around the country. Thanks a lot, James.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a good day.
See you guys.